Hello all, welcome to this session. In this session, I'm going to answer one of the Java interview questions. That is, what are checked exceptions in Java? Let me answer. In Java, there are two types of exceptions. One is checked exceptions and other one are unchecked exceptions. Then what are checked exceptions? Checked exceptions are the types of exceptions in Java where the compiler will check for these exceptions and suggest that there is a possibility of the exception in the code before you run the code. Okay. During the compile time itself, the compiler will detect in a particular line there is a possibility of an exception. Such kind of exceptions are called as checked exceptions. Then what about unchecked exceptions? Unchecked exceptions are not checked by the compiler. Compiler will not suggest you that there is a possibility of exception in that particular line, even though there is a possibility. Okay. Such kind of exceptions which are not checked by the compiler are called as unchecked exceptions. The exceptions which can be checked by the compiler in advance before you run the program during the compile time at this particular line of code, there's a possibility of this kind of exception. Such kind of exceptions fall into the checked exceptions category. I'm going to give you some examples as part of practical demonstration to understand what exactly the checked exceptions are. For that, I'll switch to the Eclipse IDE. Here in this project, I'm going to create a new file, new Java file. I'll name this file with any different name, some random name, let's say class 14 or something. I'll just name this as class 14. So class 14 and click on main method. And inside that class 14, inside the main method, I'm going to write one line where compiler will compile the code and suggest that there is a possibility of an exception here. For example, if I write thread.sleep, that is a predefined class in Java and it has a static predefined method known as sleep method. And when I call this method and say 3000 milliseconds, if I give, you see I'm getting an error. It's a compiler error. Why this kind of compiler error is coming when I am writing thread.sleep here? When I hover the mouse, you can understand that the compiler is checking that there's a possibility of exception. Compiler, with the help of this compiler error during the compile time at this particular line 7 is suggesting that with this thread.sleep, there is a possibility of interrupted exception. What if this program is running in a multi-threaded environment and an interrupted kind of exception will occur when any other thread will stop the program from halting. Okay. If this thread is there, the thread will halt for 3 seconds because of thread.sleep, the program will halt for 3 seconds. But what if any other thread will come into the program? If it is multi-threaded program, then another thread will disturb this thread.sleep and interfere here or interrupt this waiting time. So there is a possibility of interrupted exception it is saying, though even though it is a single threaded program, but still the compiler will suggest that sometimes. Okay. So if the compiler is suggesting that there is a possibility of an exception here and you try to surround this with a try catch block like this, okay, then this kind of exceptions which are suggested by compiler are called as checked exception. For example, thread.sleep interrupted exception falls into the, if I say control Z here and go back here, what type of exception this compiler is suggesting there is a possibility interrupted exception, right? There is a possibility of interrupted exception. The compiler is suggesting me before I run the code. So this is one example of checked exception where the interrupted exception is checked by the compiler, okay, before we run the code. Another example where we can get the checked exception is buffered or file input stream. I'll write file input stream. FIS is equal to new file input stream. I'll write file input stream. And I'll import this control shift O. It will import the file input stream from java.io package. And here in the constructor cannot be empty, guys. We have to pass a file. I'll create a file here. File1 is equal to new file of, I'll give some abc.txt file here. Okay, abc.txt file. Whether this particular file exists or not doesn't matter. Control Shift O, file will be imported from java.io package. Now I'm going to give this file one here in this constructor. Despite of giving the file in this constructor or this line is giving me a compiler error saying that compiler is suggesting that there is a possibility of unhandled exception type. You have to handle the file not found exception. What if this particular abc.txt file doesn't exist at this path? In that case, what you will do is saying, okay. So here also, before I run the code, the compiler during the compile time at the line 13, here at this line, when I hover the mouse, it's suggesting that there's a possibility of file not found exception. So apart from the interrupted exception, another exception, another example for checked exceptions category is file not found exception, which is which will be suggested by the compiler. That's why it's called as checked exception, because it is checked by the compiler that there is a possibility of this file not found exception or not. Okay. So file not found exception also will fall into the checked category of the exception types. So these are few examples of the checked exceptions, guys. There are many other examples that you may come across while working with the Java programs. And when the compiler detects there's a possibility of such kind of exceptions during the compile time itself before you run the program, such kind of exceptions in Java are called as checked exceptions. If the compiler doesn't suggest, for example, if I write int a is equal to 9 divided by 0, here there is a possibility of arithmetic exception, but here you cannot divide a number by 0 in Java, guys, but compiler is not suggesting us anything here. Okay. When you run the code during the runtime only, you will get the exception as arithmetic exception. These kind of exceptions are not called as checked exceptions because the compiler is not checking them in advance. Okay. Before you run the code, while the code is get in the compile time, during the compile time, while the compiler is compiling this Java code, when you are writing the code, before running the code, if the compiler detects and suggests that there is a possibility of exception at this particular line, such kind of exceptions are called as checked exceptions. And other type of exceptions like dividing a number by 0, arithmetic exception, and trying to store an extra element into the array behind the size. Such kind of exceptions, compiler will not suggest there is a possibility. Such kind of exceptions are called as unchecked exceptions. So hope guys with practical demonstration you understood what are checked exceptions in Java. Checked exceptions are the exceptions in Java which are checked by the compiler during the compile time before you run the program. Okay. And compiler will suggest that there's a possibility of exception at this particular line of code before you run the code. Such kind of exceptions are called as checked exceptions. So that's all for this session. Thank you. Bye-bye.